Thanks, Simon. Brandon's just going to pull up our slides for us. But as Simon said, we're here to talk to you today a bit about thriving and what it means and how it happens or doesn't on campuses. And so thank you for that introduction, Simon. We wanted to share kind of a little bit about ourselves and how we come to this work. So I come to this work as a cisgender bi woman, as someone who's been involved in 2SLGBTQ plus youth programming and research for over a decade. And I've been with the Thriving team since the grant writing stage, bringing some knowledge in qualitative research methods. And I'll turn it to David.
Great, thank you very much. Just making sure I'm unmuted. I am, and it's a pleasure to be with you all here today. My name is David, and I come to this research as a cisgender man, queer man, and I have been at the University of Toronto for quite a number of years, and in that capacity have a long history of supporting and working with 2SLGBTQ plus students, and came to this project through my role as the interim director of the Sexual and Gender Diversity Office a few years ago as part of the steering committee. And so it's my pleasure now to be part of it, to kind of be able to process some of the data, the wealth of data that this project has collected. So that's my my approach to this. I'll pass it to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brandon Smith. I use the pronouns he and him, and I'm a doc candidate at Michigan State University. And as Simon explained, I worked in student affairs at a bunch of universities prior to beginning PhD studies. And I think my lenses as a cisgendered gay man linked with my previous career prior to beginning my doctoral studies is really what influences my view in terms of this research, which I was invited to join by my advisor, Dr. Chris Renn, who wishes she could be here today, but she's observing Thanksgiving in the United States.
Okay, so let's get into it. We have a bit of an agenda, and hey, we've already checked off one point, which is our introductions and positionalities. I'm going to share a little bit about the rationale or kind of the focus for our specific work. We're going to go over some of the research literature and then talk a bit about institutional context as it helps to frame this project, our methodology, our findings, implications for universities and colleges, and then kind of pose some critical questions to you to reflect on in relation to this work. So if you're joining us here today, it's possible that you caught day one of the conference or are connected to our study in other ways. So you likely already know that the Thriving on Campus project is focused on campus climate for 2SLGBTQ plus students. Now, from the outset of this study, we've been aiming to better understand how campus climate can be both positively and negatively affecting 2SLGBTQ plus students. And alongside that, have a commitment to exploring how best to support 2SLGBTQ plus students in their university experiences. And specifically, we want to focus on that first word in our project name. We want to talk about thriving. And what we're discussing today is actually drawn from a manuscript that we have in preparation. And so hopefully you'll get a chance to kind of read that in full soon. And I say soon in the very academic publishing timeline sense of soon. So, fingers crossed on that. Now, an understanding of queer thriving on campus is crucial because 2SLGBTQ plus people have historically been and presently are pathologized, medicalized, institutionalized, and shamed in various ways. And it's important to push back against those narratives, to move beyond mere acceptance and tolerance and towards something more hopeful. As researchers tend to do, but sometimes forget to say, we can end up making a lot of assumptions along the way about what we mean by some of the concepts that we use. Things like resilience and thriving, but it's important to contextualize them. So what do we mean by thriving? Well, there's lots of discussion in higher ed circles And I'm going to turn it over to Brandon to discuss that and get into some of the context, and then come back to how we're taking it up in our project. So Brandon, over to you. Feel like a newscaster.
So I'll offer a quick overview of the literature that influences the work for this specific project. And first, the Okanagan Charter in 2015 seems to be the shift for Canadian post-secondary education campuses to foster students within a healthier campus climate. So for context, the charter was delivered from the International Conference on Health Promoting Universities and Colleges and was intended to build a common language regarding health on campus and establish a framework for principles and calls to action for post-secondary education campuses to, one, embed health into all aspects of a university or college campus, and two, lead health promotion, including outside campus engagement. Now, not every campus explicitly cites this charter nor relates it to thriving per se, but the academic year following the charter's development seems to have been the shift where thriving priorities seem to emerge on Canadian campuses. So from here, we've observed that research focused on thriving, particularly over the last decade, has been used as a way to respond to this call from the charter. Specifically, Schreiner's 2010 work on thriving highlights that thriving is a mindset connected to psychological well-being, which emulates feelings of value, positivity, and momentum toward a specific goal. And research on mindsets focuses on the cognitive and emotional development within an individual and considers why and how one's attitudes and beliefs influences their behavior. So in the context of student success in post-secondary education, thriving has been used to describe students who are, quote, fully engaged intellectually, socially, and emotionally, and are not only academically successful, they also experience a sense of community and a level of psychological well-being that contributes to their persistence to graduation. And this research distinguishes this mindset from others, such as resilience, grit, or vitality. And while they're in relationship at times, it's really important to emphasize that these are each very different. And while there is significant literature focused on the experiences of the 2SLGBTQ+ community and how they interact with campus climate, for example, recent research emphasizes how this community broadly experiences complex, multiple, and multidimensional transitions as they enter campus. This can range from coming out or even coming out again to finding community to even establishing feelings of safety to be who they are. And overall, this broad population's ability to thrive really depends on the person. So who they are, their characteristics, where they come from, and who is supporting them, as well as the conditions within the environment, like a university campus, and whether or not they are set up to be successful to do so. So now we're going to focus on what campuses are saying. So as I said, since 2015, Canadian post-secondary education campuses have endeavored to promote healthier climates. And this is often led by student affairs and or student well-being areas of the campus. And in all, when it comes to universities' ideologies across campuses, we see thriving positioned in different ways, and sometimes interchangeably or even incorrectly with each other, with other mindset frameworks. So we present just a few examples to illustrate this. So first, at Western University Student Experience Office, Dr. Schreiner's thriving work has influenced a framework for all students focused on engaged learning, academic determination, positive perspective, diverse citizenship, and social connectedness. Where at U of T's New College, their view of thriving is noted to be connected specifically to first-year transitions. Thrive at New College concentrates on offerings noted to help academic, social, and personal transition, and it's not clear if this is through active or passive engagement. So both at Toronto Metropolitan University and Mohawk College, they take a self-improvement approach to thriving by way of a 10-week in-person or independently driven programming model. And this is structured programming. The structured programming model is focused on improving motivation, optimism, and resilience, again, from the views of personal and academic success. And at Wilfrid Laurier University, they use a thriving campaign as a way for students to improve mental health literacy, build community, and understand campus resources, and motivate students to be proactive and preventative about their wellness. And outside of programming around these promises, therapy dog events and activities such as yoga are planned, and you can even get a button. Kidding aside, many campuses offer some sort of swag item which highlights the institution's campaign or the programming related to the thriving experiences. So it doesn't matter what the campus context is, their type, their size, or location. These examples show that thrive and thriving are used differently, and in some cases interchangeably within different coping strategies such as resilience. And the intention isn't to pick on any campus. This is just to illustrate that these specific offerings are certainly developed with good intentions, but there could be unintended consequences due to the inconsistent engagement with scholarship of this topic. So with campus offerings and the literature in mind, Lauren will now share more about our methodological choices related to our research.
So Thriving on Campus is a cross-sectional mixed method study with several different phases. We started off with a scan of policies, resources, and services focused on 2SLGBTQ+ students, then a province-wide online survey, which by now you've probably heard lots about, and then into follow-up interviews with 2SLGBTQ+ students, some of who completed the survey, so drawn from the survey, and then into webinars to share findings with various stakeholders. And so if you've attended any of the conference talks or perhaps looked at some of the resources on the project site, you might have learned a lot about the survey stage and know that using the full survey sample, we identified 5 latent profiles based on campus climate, academics, and well-being variables. Now, today we want to focus on findings from student interviews. At the end of the survey portion of the study, students were invited to share their email addresses if they were interested in being contacted for follow-up interviews. Among the subsample of respondents who are interested in being interviewed, we selected 50 students, specifically aiming for 10 participants representing each profile. Now, given the importance of considering students' myriad identities, we attended to diversity across race, disability, and institutional context. And by institutional context, I mean things like size, urban and rural locations, and academic offerings. So we sampled across those criteria. Now, the interviews covered a range of topics, including day-to-day experiences, the good and the bad, belonging on campus, hopes for the overall student experience, discrimination, community, safe and unsafe spaces, and engagement with 2S LGBTQ+ groups and spaces on campus, to name a few. Now, in designing the interview guide, the research team had some important conversations about how to make connections across the survey and interview phases. Now, before I passed it off to Brandon, I raised a question about how we as researchers define thriving and how the concept is taken up within higher ed spaces. But whose definitions of thriving matter most, or whose should matter most? Well, we'd say 2S LGBTQ+ students' definitions are pretty important. And this was something that came up during the design of the qualitative phase. We had this moment of reflection on the name of the study, Thriving on Campus, and asked ourselves, well, what does thriving mean? How will we know if students are thriving? And can we build in a component, or why not build in a component where we ask them directly? So in the interview set of questions, after students had been reflecting on their university experiences at length, we said, hey, so our project is named Thriving on Campus, and thriving is something that we're still working to define and understand. But what does thriving mean to you? What does it mean to you as a 2S LGBTQ+ student to thrive on campus? And what can universities and colleges do to realize that vision of thriving? This then led to some follow-up questions about what an ideal campus might look like and how participants' identities, as they described them, might factor in. And so those are the areas we want to narrow in on today. Now, the whole of the interviews were coded by 2 project analysts, Katie Cook and Charlie Davis, using thematic analysis. And from that analysis, David, Brandon, Chris, and myself focused in on interview transcript data housed under what we call a parent code of defining thriving on campus. And that section had previously been organized into 2 subsections, one framed as acceptance and inclusion, and the other as holistic support to flourish. Now, David took the lead on preliminary analysis of these two areas, noting patterns of responses that emphasize the role of the institution or the role of the individual as key to thriving, with some responses representing a mix of the two. So then Chris, Brandon, myself, and David came together to kind of discuss these patterns, which resulted in the data being sorted into 3 categories that we've come to conceptualize as a continuum. And I'm going to turn it over to David to share more about the continuum and what participants were saying.
Thanks so much, Lauren. So it's hard to know who's on the call today, but I'll say that for some of us, and perhaps many of us working closely with 2SLGBTQ+ students on our campuses, the findings we present may sound familiar, actually. But worth noting too, however, is how many of these students expect their institutions to deliver and actively engage them in order for them to thrive, something institutions, we think, must be aware of. So in their definitions of thriving on campus, interview participants described thriving in a variety of ways. We saw their responses predominantly falling into 3 categories. Those are thriving on campus as an individual responsibility. On the other side of the continuum, thriving on campus as an institutional responsibility. And then this large section in between with a mix of both institutional and individual responsibilities. And participants who defined thriving as both individual and institutional described the source of thriving on their campus as partly within and partly beyond their control and dependent on their academic institution playing an active role in 2SLGBTQ+ thriving. So let's get into some of the data because I'd love for you to hear student voices and the data that we were working with. Perhaps the smallest, not perhaps, the smallest of the group of participants were those who defined thriving on campus as largely individual. So despite a small group, we needed to account for these students and we remained curious about what left these students with the belief that thriving remained their responsibility. I think what we may have heard earlier might kind of gesture to some of the reasons, but we certainly can't be definitive about those yet. But these students articulated thriving as largely an individually mediated phenomenon, achieved or not achieved by their actions or inactions, or the actions or inactions of those around them, the individual actions or inactions of those around them. So while students in this category describe thriving using terms or descriptions such as being normal, authenticity, holistic wellness, and personal growth and success, individual definitions of thriving noted or gestured to how thriving is hard to define because it's so individualized. Everyone has a different idea of what thriving means. So to give you a sense of what that individual idea of thriving looks like, we have some quotes here, and I'd like to go through some of them. The first quote, "I don't feel like I do thrive. So it's just something else like, I haven't really imagined what that would be. So I don't know. I think really something that like I could do would be to be out as a TDA. And I don't do it because I'm scared, because I don't know. This was not at my institution, but I've had someone say that it's not professional to talk about gender identity as an academic person." Another student said, "Thriving means to do more than just survive, more than just go through the motions every day. It means to actually be engaged in wanting to improve and continue and just wanting to grow. And as a 2SLGBTQ student, thriving would mean to be normal." And finally, "What thriving means to me is more of just like growing as a person, understanding yourself, and then building a way to accept yourself or change certain things that you do not like about yourself to an extent. Like if it causes you like mental pain or something like to change your sexuality, that's a different story." So for those whose definitions of thriving were firmly situated on the individual side of the continuum, a defining characteristic of thriving was that the responsibility for thriving rested on the individual and their actions or inactions. Go to the next slide. Thanks, Brandon. On the opposite side, responses that firmly situated thriving as an institutional responsibility emphasize the importance of an institutional or campus environment conducive to thriving. So students described conditions and supports that would need to be in place in order for them to thrive. Here we've listed safe and welcome, thriving as being safe and welcomed, seen and celebrated, included and consulted on decision-making, represented in curriculum and among faculty and staff, and supported and resourced. So, basic things need to be in place before anyone does any thriving. I need basic decency first. I need to be treated as a person and respected in all of my intersections. I need the racism to stop. I need the bigotry to stop before I can even get to like, I'm no longer scared. Now let's talk about thriving, right? And so if we explore this topic a little bit more, we've had to make choices about what we can talk about or not. We'll move to the next slide. And we wanted to talk about welcoming and safe spaces. And while safety remains a real concern for many 2SLGBTQ+ students, many were clear to differentiate what it means to feel safe from being welcomed on and throughout their campuses, thriving only possible when with the latter conditions. So thriving would be having an environment that's not just like, oh, this professor is supportive and this center is supportive and I feel safe at these two places. It's actually creating an entire campus that makes people feel safe. So people don't have to hide their identities, but people can also like question their identities, and they don't have to like second guess what they're saying and who they're saying it to. Another student suggested that a campus is your home. So it's like I'm welcomed in my room, but I'm not welcomed in the kitchen. And finally, a collective effort by those in charge to make it a space where people not only feel safe, like, do I feel unsafe on campus? No. But do I feel welcomed and engaged based on my identity? No. So yeah, we'll move on to the next one in terms of being seen and celebrated. A shift from surviving to thriving is critical. And I think that the quote that you see on the screen nicely draws our attention to the many costs on students, 2SLGBTQ students, of navigating a campus and classrooms that are less than safe. Just going home and like re-energizing yourself to once again go out. So this student says, I think if a queer student was thriving on campus, they would feel like their identity is celebrated, to feel like their ideas and their energies are celebrated, and that the interactions that they have on campus don't empty them, but fill them up. So that when they're done having a class or they're done interacting with a professor, they don't feel exhausted and just want to go home. They want to go and interact with the university community further. So I think that's the difference between surviving and thriving, is like if you're surviving, you're getting through the day, and like often you're just going home and like re-energizing yourself to once again go out. Whereas if you're on a campus and you're thriving, you're provided a space to fill up that cup and might continue to have fun. And I think that it's interesting to read this, to hear this quote in relation to some of the ways in which thriving is kind of characterized or described or even pursued in some of the examples that Brandon raised earlier, which is something that our paper is thinking about. Finally, somewhere in between firmly places thriving as an either institutional or individual responsibility. There were many students whose responses suggest understanding thriving as not either or, but both and. In addition to reasserting characteristics of holistic wellness and personal success in their definitions of thriving on campus, students in this category at times placed explicit expectations on their specific institution. While safety remains a real concern for many 2SLGBTQ+ students, many were clear to differentiate safety from feeling welcomed on and throughout their campuses. Defining thriving through comfort and the ability to be oneself, to talk about one's identity and experiences, without the fear of punishment or retribution. These are the conditions, along with being seen and celebrated, that conveyed welcome for 2S LGBTQ+ students. So as you can see on the quote here, I think for me, like when I'm thriving really anywhere is when I feel myself, like I feel comfortable. I can talk about who I am and my identity and my struggles and triumphs. Yeah, so like the thriving aspect is being able to be me, and I'm not punished for it like queer folks usually are in society. So we've had to make some choices, of course, about which aspects of the mixed we can focus on. But in addition to the need for specific clubs and groups, responses to thriving on campus in this category also outline the need for 2S LGBTQ+ inclusive culture and spaces to be integrated across the university and not only siloed to specific and discrete spaces and environments on campus. And I think this is a key point to make. For students who saw thriving as a mix of both individual and institutional responsibilities, community was a condition for thriving on campus. Participants shared the following as to where and how institutions can nurture and promote safe spaces necessary for 2S LGBTQ+ thriving on campus. So one student said, I think that thriving on campus, like first and foremost, I think that having like queer education be integrated into a lot more subjects other than solely sexuality studies, and have it recognized as like a genuine intersectionality that should be talked about, especially when talking about like social determinants of health or any kind of social service or policy perspective. Having queer education and queer understood in curriculum, I think would provide a lot safer and a lot more like awareness about it. And finally, another student said, I think, yes, it's important to have like 2S LGBTQ+ groups. It's also important to have that inclusion within other groups, right? So that, you know, you can belong there. You don't have to go to the movie night for the Rainbow Club or whatever, you know, that, hey, I can go to the Rainbow night, but I can also go to Monte Carlo night and there's going to be a rainbow table. Like just, it's okay for me to be wherever I am. So in many ways, this involves broad and integrated efforts across campuses, departments, and divisions to ensure 2S LGBTQ+ inclusion, because being relegated to their siloed LGBTQ+ offices and spaces doesn't translate into thriving on campus for queer, trans, and two-spirit students. So I apologize for speaking so quickly. I wanted to make sure we had a little bit of time for questions. So I'll pass it on to Brandon to take us through some of the implications now.
So we look at implications for practice from 4 lenses. First, what the campus can concentrate on as a whole, from the lens of leadership of the university, administrators, and decision makers, and last, practitioners, so student-facing groups on campus. So first, it's important for campus to understand how your definition of thriving fits within both the higher education and research contexts. We also caution for program replication. Sometimes we hear about, you know, a hot new program or this buzzword approach to specific programming that's offered within our campuses. But before replicating this, it's important to consider your campus's specific context. So consider who this programming or this commitment would include and or exclude, which can also be very dependent on your campus characteristics. So who your students are, where they're coming from, whether it's a commuting campus, who is this priority? Who is this priority for, and are they included in this? Next is leadership. So it's important to develop and resource systems, structures, and programs that align with your campus's vision of thriving. So if your campus is making a thriving commitment, it's important to understand how the commitment is aligned with the institution's vision and question whether or not these areas are adequately resourced to carry this out, not just by way of budget, but also capacity, the understanding of this work, but also their experience and expertise. And this work really can't be the corner of somebody's desk. It really needs to be something that is really well thought out. Next is from the lens of administrators. So it's important to evidence campus accountability. So define, evaluate, and assess thriving measures on your campus And in terms of those resources, it's important to also advocate for above. So, advocate above for those resources. So we're not just.
Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I see time is flying by. So I apologize. I really don't like doing that. But I was wondering if we will be, if it would be possible to just keep maybe 2 minutes for the last 2 minutes for Q&A before we go to the next presentation, because yeah, we're in a tight schedule this morning. I really apologize. So I was wondering if there's any question for the presenters today. I saw there was one question asking in the first day of the conference, one of the speakers used the term peaceful place versus safe space. Are they both used equally, or are they the same or not? Or what are your thoughts on that? Anyone wants to jump in? Peaceful versus safe.
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure how peaceful place was used or framed in that first presentation. So we don't like as a team or haven't engaged with peaceful place as a concept. But I think for us, we're kind of troubling that idea of safe space, and our participants are troubling that idea of safety as something that needs to move beyond just am I physically safe or safe from discrimination, but am I welcomed? So not something that we currently explicitly engage in, but thanks for kind of tipping us off to that.
Yeah.
Thanks. Is there any other question? I don't see any other written question. But I was wondering, one question that I have, I think you are asking very important questions and raising important points around the fact that thriving shouldn't be only kind of an individual affair versus like improving the climate and the structure. So what would be one suggestion for universities who are having more of maybe an individualistic focus right now in the way they consider thriving? What would you suggest them to do to change this focus a little bit?
I'm going to throw it to Brandon because you had to rush through the implications.
Could you repeat the question? I'm really sorry, it cut out there.
Oh, no, I was just thinking, like, if universities are sometimes using the term thriving with more of an individualistic kind of perspective or focus, like asking students to do things to thrive rather than changing the environment. I'm saying some universities are doing that. So what do you suggest in terms of maybe switching the focus to something more structural? What is a first step that they should do?
Yeah, I think it's really evidencing that we're listening to students. So one of our last points here for implications was, beyond programming, if we're, having these spaces for students to share their perspectives, or whether that's by way of evaluations or surveys on campus, how can that campus also show students that they're responding to what they're requesting or saying that they're needing? So I think creating that dialogue in very formal and informal ways is important. Students are changing the ways they communicate, whether that's by way of social media or in person. So really thinking about that and being intentional, I think, is important.
Thank you so much, Brandon. So thanks a lot, David, Brandon, and Lauren. And I apologize for cutting you off. Really don't like having to do that. It was super interesting. So thanks a lot, and a big kind of round of virtual applause for you all.